Who I'd like to bring up next is Dr. Karl Aspelund, who's a professor at Rhode Island University. And I want to make sure that I call the name of the department correct because I always call it incorrectly. He is the assistant professor in the Department of Textiles, Fashion, Merchandising, and Design at the University of Rhode Island. And his interests really lay in the area of the role of textiles in the creation of identity for humans. But what he's going to talk about right now is biomimicry in textiles and how looking at solving problems off planet can really help us solve problems on the planet.
Thank you, May. Good afternoon. Yes, Lou earlier talked about small thinking. I think I'm going to go for a little bit of local thinking, if I may. My concerns here go up into space, but then they come back to Earth very, very quickly. As has been pointed out before in here today, we're entering with this idea into a new phase of human culture. We're proposing that soon we will have 3 distinct populations of humans. We'll have possibly independent populations of humans. Obviously, the population on Earth we're counting on remaining. We will have bases on Mars, it would seem, Moon, very likely, and then, of course, the Starship, which we hope within 100 years to have the capability to send off. Now, the question in my mind is, all right, what does this mean? What does this demand? If we're going to do this, from my perspective as an anthropologist and a designer, what do we need? What are we going to do? And, of course, the first thing that comes up is that if we are going to put 1,500 people on a ship and send them off into space, they must have their needs met sustainably. It has to be a closed-loop environment, and the basic human needs of shelter, food, shelter including clothing, becomes tricky at that point. We also have to have suitable and acceptable levels of hygiene and comfort, and I would like to emphasize the words suitable and acceptable. There may be in this, and I'll talk about this later today, I have another talk here in a few moments, I suppose, where we're going to wonder about what actually is suitable and acceptable for a community like that. And what we're talking about there is that we may perhaps need a little bit of regression. We may have to go back to earlier human practices within the framework of spaceflight. We have to go beyond the properties of basic fibers and structures as we know them today. And Dr. McKnight just mentioned systems. Well, think of it for a second. We're all sitting here suitably clothed for the occasion, in acceptable levels of comfort, I believe, although it's slightly warm in here. You are using a system that has been fairly consistent within human culture for anywhere between 10 and 40,000 years, depending on who you're talking to and what you're looking at. Now, I would propose that this necessitates an examination of the nature and culture of clothing and human habitation in general. We may find ourselves at the point within the next 100 or 200 years, depending on who you're asking here on my right, that we have to re-examine what it means to be clothed, that we have to re-examine this tens of thousand years old culture of harvesting, spinning, weaving, dyeing, cutting, sewing, clothing. And just as a matter of interest, might I ask for a show of hands how many of you have made a garment? Okay, you're coming along. The rest of you, stock up on cash. So what we need here, and the research collaborations I would like to propose by being here this week, is that we need radical solutions to this problem. This is not a trivial matter, at least not from where I'm standing. Unless we propose to send 1,500 people unclothed to the next star. And that's a possibility. We might do that. We might reverse notions of modesty. We might enhance human skin to not require clothing. This might be very likely a climate-controlled environment on board the ship. So warmth, coolness, cold might not be a problem. So it might just be a question of engineering skin, and Ronki would know more about that than I would. But if not, if we're going to stay within the human framework of the past 40,000 years, and I'm not necessarily suggesting we do, we're going to have to do some radical investigations into this. We're going to have to miniaturize all our processes. Right now, in order to get you your shirts and T-shirts and jeans and stuff, there are roomfuls of equipment required. That's not going to work. We also have to minimize the ecological footprint of this. The textile industry, historically and currently, is one of the most environmentally hostile industries that humans perform. We have to minimize the use of chemicals, we have to minimize the use of fertilizers, etc., etc., etc. And by the way, what exactly are we going to be fertilizing? This is not the Little Prince. There are no sheep in space. And we may have to rethink that. So what I'm suggesting is that the investigations required are both processes and cultural. We need the anthropologist from Canada. We need the geneticist. We need the chemist. Only for the clothing, my goodness. Think about all the other things we need to think about. I'm just talking the clothes. And we have to rethink these processes all the way through the life cycle, from the genesis to the regenesis. It has to be a closed-loop system. And there we are, into finally, this requires perhaps an investigation into biomimetic processes, where we have to think about both process and behavior. We have to think about what exactly happens when we are clothed and when we are making these things, and what our biology requires and what our habits require. And we can get into things like uniforms and hierarchy. And we talked about the possibility of a militarized situation rather than a libertarian situation. Well, as soon as you get into a militarized situation, you have uniforms. But I will leave you with this thought right now, that if we look at the entire product life cycle from genesis to recycling, that is the ultimate biomimicry, where everything that is wasteful becomes material for something else. Any waste that is produced becomes material for something else. This is something that our industrial world must solve, and therefore this research comes back to Earth immediately. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator.